Hello and welcome to the video for Chapter 8, Section 5, A Time of Crisis. I'm actually going to break this section up into two videos. All right, so this would be video 5A. In this one, we're going to be talking about the Black Death, and in the next one, video 5B, we're going to be talking about the 100 Years' War. But as you can tell just from the titles of those, the common theme throughout these is, as you see in the title, crisis. So this chapter is about a period we call the High Middle Ages, which signifies that it was an improvement over the early Middle Ages, which we refer to as the Dark Ages, and for the most part, it was an improvement. Warfare had declined, trade and money was leading to an overall increase in the standard of living, and there was a cultural flourishing like we talked about in the previous section. This is not to say, though, that Europe was some peaceful utopia where everyone lived happily ever after. The High Middle Ages was still a rough time to be alive. There was still warfare, life for peasants was still pretty lousy, and there was still disease. In fact, the first thing we're going to discuss in this section is an outbreak of disease that would be one of the deadliest in world history, and we refer to that as the Black Death. Now, the Black Death was a name that Europeans gave to an outbreak of a disease called the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague is a particularly nasty disease that ends in a pretty painful death. As this medieval little drawing shows, you would break out in these sores, particularly up around your neck, but you could get them all around your body. They're referred to as buboes, hence the name bubonic plague, and they would turn kind of like a darkish color, almost like a dark purple, and in some cases borderline black, and hence the name why the Europeans referred to as the Black Death. And it was, you died fairly painfully, with typically either bleeding out or, asphyxiating and through suffocating, things of that nature. Now, it had been around for a while before this time period, and then had been outbreaks of it in Europe, Asia, and North Africa, but the Black Death was an especially deadly strain of it. It actually started in Asia, specifically northern China and Mongolia. Now, we haven't learned about this yet, but in the 1200s, Mongol armies conquered much of Asia all the way into Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So you see the Mongol Empire is everything here in red. It was one of the biggest empires in the history of the world. So if the disease would have started somewhere in this region and then it kind of spread outwards, staying first in Asia through the first couple of decades, but eventually is going to start working its way west. And as it spread throughout Asia, it led to rampant death. It may have killed as many as 35 million people in China alone. Now, it eventually makes its way into Europe in the year 1347, and it spread along trade routes. Hold on, let me delete my line so you can see clearly all the stuff here. All right, so again, this is where it starts in the Far East in China and Mongolia, and then it works its way along here. Hopefully you guys remember from a previous chapter that this was the Silk Road that it travels along, and you see some of the other minor ones as it goes, and then eventually works its way through the Middle East and into the Mediterranean Sea that we see here. And from there, it's going to get into Europe. And the Mongols were actually partially responsible for this. You see, besides conquest, the Mongols encouraged trade, so merchants regularly traveled from East Asia to the Middle East. Now, something we have discussed was how trade between Europe and the Middle East opened up in the later Middle Ages, especially after the Crusades. And we've talked a lot about how conquest and trade can lead to cultural diffusion, but it also leads to the physical spreading of things. Sometimes, though, and unfortunately in this case, the thing being spread was disease. And it was spread through fleas and rats. The fleas are the actual carriers, right? So the actual disease, the bubonic plague, it's carried by the fleas. The fleas jump onto the rats, and the rats are the ones that do kind of the actual traveling for it a lot of the time. But the fleas sometimes as well. They would occasionally jump onto the clothes of traveling merchants and soldiers, and they could journey hundreds of miles. The rats would climb onto merchant ships in the Middle East and get off in Italian port cities. Now, knowing how it spread is important, but it doesn't tell us the full picture of why it spread so fast. Let's go over a couple of reasons why this epidemic spread so quickly. An epidemic is a rapidly spreading outbreak of disease. And you can see by the map how quickly this spread. Okay, you look at the years. 1347 is the first known outbreaks in Europe. All right, so we're looking at more of that orange color. And it's in Constantinople, Capital of the Byzantine Empire, major trade center. You see how it's approaching from Asia in 1346, coming in through these trade routes. And then from there, by the marine routes, as you see up here, it's starting to go into these different port cities. All right, so with the green, we're seeing Italy, we're seeing Greece, even some areas in North Africa. And then even very quickly, within that first year, it goes from Italy up here into France, into large sections of Spain. By the following year, 1349, it's got all of Central Europe, places that today would be Germany and Austria and the Czech Republic and so forth, including even island nations such as England and Ireland up here. So from 1347 to 1351, it's only 4 years, it encompassed the entire continent of Europe. All right, so this thing spread very, very quickly. Now, I already mentioned that plagues have been kicking up since ancient times. What was it about this one that spread it so far and so fast? First and foremost, it had to do with an increase in trade, like we just talked about on the previous slide in the previous map. Now, the irony is that if this plague had broken out in China during the Dark Ages, it probably would have stayed in Asia. But trade between Europe and other parts of the world had opened up by the late Middle Ages, and interregional trade within Europe, meaning trade between all of these places, all right, that was common by the late Middle Ages. Another reason was the living conditions. Let me just erase this. We said at the end of the last slide that fleas on rats were the carriers. Well, the pre-modern world was not very hygienic by today's standards. Medieval Europe did not have sanitation systems or sewers. As you can see from this engraving, you basically took your trash and you dumped it out the window. Rats thrived in these conditions. They infested ships, they infested towns, even the houses of wealthy noblemen. A common scene of any large gathering was to first swat the mice off the table before starting to eat. So medieval Europe was a great time to be a rat, and consequently, it was a good time to be a flea carrying the bubonic plague. Similar to the problem of living conditions, there was the lack of medical knowledge at the time, and this prevented people from really understanding how this disease spread. Even back then, people knew that you couldn't get close to somebody with the plague, but they didn't really understand how it was spread, so they couldn't take proper steps to prevent it. When this was the doctor that was coming to attend to you, somebody that looks like something out of a horror movie, this beak that they wore in the front, it was an elongated snout that they would keep herbs and flowers and things like that in, that they actually believed would keep away the plague. They didn't understand germ theory. They didn't know that there are these microscopic little organisms that can kind of get through clothing like this and could possibly infect you. They also didn't know the best ways to prevent it. Right? Look at the instructions being told around the world right now. Besides keeping your distance, everyone is instructed to wash your hands, have proper hygiene. That's because we know about germs today. They didn't know about germs back then, nor did they really know how to treat somebody with plague. So all this added up to a situation perfect for the rapid spread of disease. Now that we've gone over what the Black Death was and how it spread, let's go over the effects of the plague. First and foremost, you had a lot of death. The plague killed 35 million people in China, and some estimates think as much as 1/3 of Europe's population died. That means 1 out of every 3 people was dead. And this led to an overall breakdown of normal life. The plague led to widespread fear and panic. This thing killed very quickly, and it was often a painful death. Let me move me so we get the full impact of this picture here. Right, the whole idea of death being personified by this skeletal figure chasing people and pursuing people, that originates from this time in the Black Death. People lived in constant fear that either they or their loved ones would be next. So normal life begins to break down, and confidence in the church declines. The church couldn't offer any answers. People started to view the plague as being sent by God to punish them for their sins. And this fear and anger also led to violence, as many people blamed Jews for the outbreak. They were blamed as a scapegoat. When people are scared and angry, they often look for a scapegoat or a person or group who they can put anything on, they can focus their anger on. And Jews were those people. They were the minority in Europe. They were non-Christian. And because of that, many of them were killed somewhat horrifically. You see in this engraving here where many were burned alive in these mass executions. So besides the social impact, there was significant economic decline as well. Production declined. Less people alive means less people to farm crops and keep the economy going. And those that lived demanded higher wages, and the suppliers of good had less since there was less production. And this in turn is going to lead in inflation, where prices begin rising very rapidly. So you've got rising prices, restrictions on production, and the fear of death. Not a good combination. This is going to lead to peasant uprisings and rebellions. Bitter, angry peasants rebelled in countries throughout Europe, leading to more death when they got violent. All right, so that will wrap things up for talking about the Black Death. A lot that we went over, so that was the reason why I decided to split these in two. And the next one, we're going to finish up this section with talking about the 100 Years' War.